Now, as the name of the video implies, this is part 7 of a story, so if you haven't seen the first several parts yet, I'd highly recommend starting at part 1, and if you like it, working your way back here. I'll include a link to all previous parts in the description below. And now, without any further ado, let's get back to the story. We get a shot of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, but instead of being taken inside of it, we're taken to somewhere far, far below it, and find ourselves in a large circular chamber where everything, the floor, ceiling, and curved walls, all seem to have been hewn from some sort of dark, glass-like rock. And in this chamber, also forming a circle and made of the same strange rock, are several large statues of ancient Sith warriors that all seem to be looking down upon one lone figure who sits cross-legged in the center of the chamber. And as we focus in on that figure, we see that it is none other than Darth Plagueis, who sits with his eyes closed while an open Sith holocron floats above the palm of his hand and gives off an eerie red glow, a glow that reflects off everything in the room, but for some strange reason reflects more intensely off the eyes of the statues that seemingly look down upon him. We then hear footsteps echo throughout the chamber and watch as Maul enters, and as he walks towards Plagueis, we see him glance at some of the statues, a somewhat nervous look upon his face that still holds reverence. We then hear Plagueis speak, and when he does, Maul instantly falls to a knee and lowers his head. "Is it done? Did Kenobi survive?" Maul replies, "Barely, but Kenobi survived. I watched from afar, as you instructed." A slight grin forms on the face of Plagueis before he says, "And you are certain you were not sensed by your old master?" Maul gives a nod. "I am certain. You have trained me well." To that, Plagueis frowns and says, "I shall be the judge of that." Maul lowers his head even further. "Of course, my master, I apologize." Plagueis then says, "And perhaps it is time to see just how well trained you have been. The Chosen One must now be dealt with." Maul hesitates before saying, "But we don't know where he has gone." Plagueis grins again. "But he can be drawn out by his mother." Maul briefly looks confused, but then starts to nod. "Yes, the boy's old home should still be in the memory banks of my probe droid. I shall leave for Tatooine at once, my master." "No," Plagueis then says, as his eyes open and the holocron closes, extinguishing the red glow from the room, but not from the eyes of the statues or from Plagueis himself. "These 3 Jedi are beyond your ability, my apprentice. We shall go and face them." We then switch scenes and get a shot of a small shuttle as it flies through hyperspace, and then we're inside the shuttle's cockpit with Qui-gon and Dooku, who sit in an almost awkward silence. It is Dooku who then says, "It is troubling you, my friend, isn't it? What I said at Padme's apartment about the Jedi needing to end." Qui-Gon gives a very slight frown and pretends to be busy with the shuttle's controls as he replies, "I'm not ready to give up on the entire order. Not yet." Dooku nods as if he completely understands that, and then suddenly says, "When I was very young, I would have visions of myself becoming a great leader." Qui-Gon stops fiddling with the controls and just listens as Dooku continues. "After I kept having these visions, I went to Master Yoda and told him, and at first he thought they were not so much visions, but a part of myself that felt I was abandoning my people on Sereno, that somehow I felt guilty that I would not spend my life in service of them." To that, Qui-Gon now nods in understanding and asks, "How did you know about your true heritage? Most of us are told so very little about where we come from." Dooku gives a sad smile. "Apparently, my father died from an illness, and my mother had a change of heart because of it, because I was their only child, the only hope for our line to continue." Dooku's smile seems to get even sadder as he finishes, "She somehow managed to get word to me, and begged for me to come home, but I chose to stay with the Jedi, and my mother died soon after." Qui-Gon offers a sympathetic look, but before he can say anything, Dooku continues, "Yoda believed these visions I was having as a child were just a manifestation of my guilt, but when I described them to him, he began to believe they were something more, and were ultimately the reason he chose to take me on as his Padawan, or so I've always believed." Qui-Gon then asks him what the visions showed, and Dooku replies, "Sometimes I would see myself as a leader of a great army, an army made up of more droids than men, and I would be fighting against the Jedi. and in the end, the Jedi would fail, and the galaxy would be consumed by a great darkness, a darkness I helped bring about. Yet other times, I would see myself as a very old man, older than I even am now, leading a new Jedi Order during a time of great peace and prosperity for the whole galaxy. Dooku then lets out a sigh and looks at Qui-Gon and says, I believe Yoda took me as his Padawan to make sure the latter would come to pass. And in order for that to happen, the Jedi as they are now must end. Qui-Gon leans back in his seat and seems to fall into deep thought, but that's when Anakin bursts into the cockpit and says they must go to Tatooine immediately, that he's had a vision and his mother is in great danger. Qui-Gon frowns and replies, Anakin, we've had this discussion more times than I care to count. We must follow... Anakin cuts him off. Follow the will of the Force, I know, but Master, why does the Force keep showing me these visions if I'm not supposed to do something about them? Qui-Gon opens his mouth to give his rebuttal, but says nothing, and instead looks at Dooku, who gives a little shrug as if to say, the kid's got a point. Qui-Gon frowns and then says to Anakin, tell me what you saw in this vision. My mother was being tortured, Anakin begins, by the same red and black faced Sith you fought back when we first met. It's now Dooku who frowns before saying, then this is clearly a trap, and it means the Sith know the importance of Anakin, and likely fear him. Qui-Gon nods in agreement to that, and Dooku continues, you faced this Sith before, my friend. Just how powerful is he? Qui-Gon frowns. He is strong with the Force, no doubt, but nothing you and I couldn't handle. And what about me? Anakin immediately asks. You, Qui-Gon begins, are what the Sith are no doubt after. You will not engage him if it can be helped. Anakin looks like he wants to protest, but falls silent and nods before saying, so we're going to save my mother then. Qui-Gon is silent for a very long moment before finally saying, no, Anakin, I'm afraid what lies ahead, but Anakin cuts him off again. I don't care what lies ahead. I wanted to become a Jedi to help people, not to fulfill some prophecy. If we don't go help my mother now, then I'm done with all of this. Finally, Qui-Gon nods, and there is a small trace of disappointment on his face as he says, we will help your mother, Anakin. But if you want to become a Jedi only to help those you care about, then you are becoming one for the wrong reasons, and your selfishness will eventually lead you down a dark path, one that is not easily turned away from. We then switch scenes and get a shot of the Senate building on Coruscant before we're taken inside Palpatine's office, where we see Mas Amedda slowly pacing about. Finally, the door slides open and Palpatine walks in and immediately asks, tell me, what news from the Senate? Mas Amedda bows low and begins, the special session just concluded and, as expected, Senator Kwame proposed the Republic sever ties with the Jedi Order, which was not initially well received until the ambassador from Mandalore said that if the Republic took such an action, all grievances with the Republic would end, providing Mandalore was allowed to freely pursue and deal with the perpetrators responsible for Satine's death, as well as any other Jedi who may stand in their way. Mas Amedda then falls silent, and clearly looks like he expects Palpatine to say something to that, but he doesn't. Finally, Amedda goes on and says, most senators seemed non-committal on the matter, and wanted to hear your thoughts on it first. To that, Palpatine smiles and makes a remark to himself about how easy it is to manipulate those fools. Mas Amedda then goes on to tell him that the only other matter brought up was Senator Amidala, and they just wanted to know where she was being held after her recent arrest for aiding and abetting the Jedi fugitives. Palpatine again gives a smile and says, tell them she is being held somewhere safe for her own protection. Mas Amedda nods, but then says, I'm not sure that will be enough for some of the senators. They are demanding, but Palpatine cuts him off. It will be enough for them if I say it is enough for them. All they need to know is she is being held somewhere secure, somewhere where she will still have some use to me. We then get a shot of the industrial district on Coruscant before we're taken into an old, run-down, and dimly lit building that used to be some type of factory perhaps, and watch as Obi-Wan Kenobi slowly walks the halls, his head lowered and with his mind clearly grappling with a great many things. After we follow him for a bit, we then suddenly see him come to a halt, and his head snaps up, and that's when we hear it too. Faint cries for help. Quickly then, Obi-Wan follows the cries, until he comes to a small holding cell that contains Padme Amidala. For a long moment, the two just stare at each other, too stunned to see each other to even know what to say. Finally, it is Obi-Wan who manages to say, Senator Amidala, what in the blazes are you doing here? Padme frowns, takes a hold of the bars and says, Does it look like I came here by choice? Obi-Wan gives a slight shake of the head before Padme asks, Can you get me out of here? Obi-Wan gives a rather eager nod and takes a couple quick steps towards the cell and then starts to look it over as if trying to find some type of locking mechanism. But then he stops himself and slowly starts to shake his head. I'm sorry, Senator, but I cannot free you. Padme seems caught off guard. You can't? She looks him over and her eyes fall upon the lightsaber he has hanging from his belt and she says, Just use your lightsaber and slice the bars. But Obi-Wan shakes his head and starts to back away from the cell. I'm sorry, Senator, but I really cannot free you. Looking angry, Padme reaches through the bars and makes a grab for Obi-Wan's lightsaber, but he catches her hand, and as soon as he touches her, there is a flash, and Obi-Wan finds himself back on Mandalore, surrounded by flames and cradling the lifeless body of Satine in his arms, as Anakin looks on. There is then another flash, and we get a scene that looks eerily similar to the first, only now Obi-Wan finds himself on a volcanic world, and in his arms he cradles the lifeless body of Padme, while Anakin again looks on. Obi-Wan then gently lays her body down and gets to his feet, and puts on the mask of Revan as he turns and faces Anakin and ignites a red lightsaber. There is then another flash, and Obi-Wan finds himself back in the present and immediately lets go of Padme's hand as he falls backwards and away from the cell. He then scurries to his feet and flees down the hall, all the while Padme cries out for him to come back and please help her. We then switch scenes and get a shot of Watto's junk shop on Tatooine before we're taken inside and see Qui-Gon, Dooku, and Anakin standing over the dead and wingless body of Watto. We then hear Qui-Gon say, I'm sorry, Anakin. But Anakin snaps back. For what? He was a slave owner. He deserved this. Qui-Gon shakes his head. Owning slaves is certainly wrong, Anakin, but he did not deserve this. It is Dooku, now holding up a datapad that he picked up from near the body, who then interrupts. It seems Watto sold your mother to someone named Klieg not long ago, and we have the location of their moisture farm. Which means, Anakin says, already moving towards the door, the Sith have her location too. We then quickly switch scenes and get a shot of a land speeder fast approaching a burning Lars homestead, and then see two dark robed figures standing out front, one much taller than the other, and on her knees with her hands up not far in front of these two figures is Shmi Skywalker, and just as the speeder is coming to a halt, Anakin tries to jump out, but both Qui-Gon and Dooku manage to restrain him. That's when the taller of the two dark robed figures, who is of course Darth Plagueis, gives a subtle nod of the head, and the shorter of the two, Darth Maul, ignites a red lightsaber and takes a couple steps forward, grabs Shmi by the hair and pulls her head up. And we then watch Anakin's horrified face as we hear the swoosh sound that a lightsaber makes when it is swung. Anakin then screams out in absolute rage and unleashes from his body a force blast that knocks Qui-Gon and Dooku off of him and clear out of the speeder. Without the slightest bit of hesitation, he now springs out of the speeder himself, ignites his saber, and charges at the two Sith. We then hear Qui-Gon yell out, "No, wait, Anakin, it's too dangerous." But Anakin ignores him and keeps running right at Maul, who has a large smile of anticipation on his face. But that smile doesn't last long, for as soon as he reaches Maul, Anakin attacks with a focused ferocity that keeps Maul completely on the defensive, and that's when we briefly focus in on the face of Darth Plagueis and see a slight grin there. We then watch as Anakin lands a blow on Maul's shoulder and quickly follows it up with a force push that sends Maul flying backwards. It's just then that Dooku and Qui-Gon reach Anakin and take up a position on each of his sides, and the three now face Darth Plagueis, who stands alone. Maul, however, quickly recovers and runs to Plagueis' side, but Plagueis raises a hand and makes a motion with his head as if Maul is to fall back. When Maul doesn't obey and instead again ignites his saber and looks like he's going to make a move towards the Jedi, Plagueis turns and says to him, "No, I have waited a lifetime to test myself against the Jedi." He then pulls a lightsaber from his robes and ignites it. Still, Maul does not fall back, and finally Plagueis reaches out with his free hand and catches Maul in a force choke and says, "You will obey me, apprentice, or you will be destroyed along with the Jedi." Plagueis then releases Maul, who looks at the Jedi one last time before finally falling back. That's when we then see Qui-Gon turn to Anakin and say, "Remember your training. If the three of us work as one, we will prevail." Anakin, though rage still burns in his eyes, nods and holds up his saber in the ready position. Qui-Gon then looks at Dooku, who nods once before igniting his saber. Finally, Qui-Gon ignites his own saber before he turns and faces Plagueis. And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part of the story, and hopefully not give me too much hate for ending it where I did. Mainly, I want to give this fight the time and attention it deserves, instead of just tacking it on to the end of this episode. So please, leave your comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.